Good morning. It came to my attention that there is very big dissatisfaction in addressing anything by the name Mishulovich these days in a manner that identifies it as being associated with, among other things, a congressional hearing that happened in relationship to alleged Russian and Ukrainian organized crime. It's occurred during the late 90s, early 2000s in conjunction with congressional hearings on transnational crime and its involvement in money laundering, as well as acts of money laundering occurring in connection with private banking activity associated with a specific bank, namely Citigroup. And Citigroup now has a program associated with providing transportation to or through the Department of Defense. There's a series of trainings that happen periodically in connection with this Citigroup program, and I contend a part of what's happened is that somebody took out treasury notes and or even bonds associated with appropriations that were for originally the Department of Defense, including going back to when I was a minor child. And insofar as certain aspects of the Department of Defense were allowed to be contracted out or subcontracted out, that those original appropriations that were part of outlay programs that used my identity in connection with them have been subcontracted out to Citigroup. And in the course of that, the refusal to acknowledge that has facilitated acts of trafficking involving me that have been very, very significant, especially since I came to Texas in 2005. To this day, I have not had anybody disclose who it was that believed they had an entitlement to claim a lease on my mineral rights, which I understand has been in effect as far as somebody else thinks they're entitled to consider themselves concerned since at least early 2006, if not before then. As a matter of fact, in May of 2016, there was alleged to have been a bust by the Internal Revenue Service of an affiliate of the Episcopal Royalty Trust, which is mentioned specifically in the 1986 Tax Reform Act when it comes to nonprofit activities associated with the gas and oil sector specifically. I contend this is in connection with what was at that time an expiration on short term subsidies that had been provided to the gas and oil sector through the federal government, ostensibly to engage in research and development around renewable energy alternatives to gas and oil, that to this day are still outstanding. However, during this time frame, my life has been allowed to be abstracted and used for all kinds of other derivative activities, up to and including weapons development. And so I've tried to deal with this the way I can. I'm mentioning this because I just tried to send some information to somebody, an author of some articles, presumably discussing matters related to gang recruitment and the United States military. This is an issue I personally have a very significant amount of concern with. Not just the military, but also the relationship of people who have former experience in the military and their intersection with local law enforcement, as well as private security, including private security connected to companies that may work within municipalities within the United States, including via contract with or through the municipality that have affiliates in other countries, and how these companies specifically are engaged in inappropriate activity, what could be considered improper payment schemes, or acts of money laundering associated with what is something that I've been pursuing in an investigation of pension fraud. What has come to my attention, however, is an urgency to directly address how prostitution and drug trafficking are literally aiding and abetting this pension fraud. Now, these days, we're in a situation, we have been for a while, where there's been a political movement to try to discuss things from a perspective of sex workers' rights, or to try to discuss it within the context of the sex workers' movement or the sex trade, including in manners related to seeing prostitution from a perspective of a form of work that could even be rendered eligible for some form of union organizing. I am not talking about this. I'm not talking about adults that are above the age of consent making a decision to take the risk of engaging in illegal activity, which until this time, prostitution is, in order to try to either normalize it or find some sort of political legitimacy when it comes to acts of prostitution that they engage willingly and knowingly as a professional consideration. I'm talking to people who have been subjected to circumstances where they are being extorted into providing sex in order to have their survival needs met, or not even their survival needs. In some cases, an understanding that the act of sex is in connection with all kinds of other economic events that also imply a willingness to cede one's bargaining position or assent to performance of a contract, including an express contract or something that could be identified as a verbal contract. And in accordance with being compelled to assent to performance of such a contract, then somebody else feels that they are entitled to claim you as their property. Literally, claim you as your property. And this gets into numerous concerns and considerations that necessarily are present when it comes to violation of constitutional amendments, including the Fifth Amendment, including perhaps even the Fourth Amendment, but including also the 14th and the 13th Amendments. These are constitutional issues. This is not just about a matter of a right to choose. And especially when we're talking about it from a concept of rights involving women or involving people that identify or are identified as a racial minority, and a consideration of what it means to be subjected to some kind of discrimination or oppression based upon your race or gender or sexual preference. Necessary consideration has to be made for those that refuse to use sex as bargaining, that refuse to use sex as economic mobility. Why, if we are going to live in a context where we talk about people and their First Amendment rights, including their First Amendment rights to freedom of choice or freedom of expression, why should we not also stand up for and support people that believe they have a constitutional right and understand they have a constitutional right to refuse to use sex in order to barter or bargain for their other material needs to be met? It's a very simple question. It reveals a very substantial and significant hypocrisy. And until we address it from that perspective, we really lack a lot of political capital and a lot of political power to actually address a lot of other issues related to structural oppression or related to the institutionalization of certain kinds of disempowerment, including certain kinds of disempowerment that have a very direct impact on public policy. I'm very concerned that the intersection of, or the manners in which the legitimization or normalization attendant with the glamorization and marketing of actual acts of prostitution is somehow being considered a viable methodology through which to negotiate when it comes to political power or even economic opportunities has supplanted other kinds of political leadership. And so we have a disproportionate focus on certain policy priorities and paradigms, including ones that not only refuse to hold accountable abuse of power, including abuse of power that has willfully and knowingly violated the law at very high levels, and in the course of doing that, attempted to entice or extort other people into agreeing to cooperate with them when it comes to crime, but also in manners that attempt to invalidate alternative political arrangements that are not predicated upon normalization of, legalization of, or legitimization of vice activity. Now, I've been someone that has been a very significant critic of, for instance, elements of the Farm Act that have been instrumental in the increasing legalization of marijuana. As a matter of fact, while we were in the course of somehow having to just accept that the country is supposed to be obligated to trillions more in obligations associated with some alleged infrastructure package, ostensibly as a result of or in concurrence with the CARES Act and what happened with the alleged health pandemic that we've been dealing with, that we're also in a course of action where we are supposed to see somehow that there is a vital civil rights issue that's being promoted with a more comprehensive legalization of marijuana. I believe this is absolutely the opposite direction of where we need to go in. And I'm going to say this blatantly. It's for my own self-interest. Why am I 44 years old and in a situation where I believe and understand that without anybody else providing me with any actual meaningful alternative to the arrangement I'm in, that after spending 3 years on the streets trying to report crime, including crime that tried to extort me into agreeing to commit acts of prostitution to get my resource needs met, am I literally in a situation where on a daily basis Over and over again, I am confronted with an understanding that I need to sleep my way into increasing my bargaining position. That my past sexual encounters had a certain political currency without me knowing that somebody else thought were entitled to obligate me to when it came to future production. This is the essence of our energy paradigm right now. How many other people knowingly and willingly committed to contracts regarding their sexual performance in order to get a job or a share in a particular financial arrangement or a settlement in regards to, or some consideration of appropriate rate structure commensurate with their preference by virtue of it engaging sexual activity or using sex acts as part of that negotiation. We're past the point of just talking about prostitution as the most bottom level, desperate street activity. And we missed that chance in 2016. That chance was completely blown in 2016 when people in the city of San Diego attempted to follow through on a grant they had received from the Department of Justice to discuss how people were not only being prostituted at younger ages, but were engaged in acts of actively recruiting and prostituting people at younger ages, including as minors. We're not just talking about minor prostitutes. We're talking about minor pimps. This was a report that was produced and was sent to the Department of Justice in the early part of 2016. The Department of Justice specifically and strategically sat on it for several months. And the actual implications of that report were not even released until after the 2016 election. The entire time this report was pending, I was in the city of Chicago in a situation where I was homeless and being compelled on a constant basis into a situation where I was supposed to understand that my indoor sleeping arrangement was contingent on paying rent. Well, you stayed here a certain amount of time, but you're not paying rent. You see, nobody told me that the rent wasn't about the fact that nobody would give me a job so I could make money. Nobody said that the rent had to do with some mineral lease somebody else had taken out and that they knew about, even if they didn't know about it in that specific manner, and that my rent was about paying with my energy and participating in some form of conveyance connected to a predetermined expectation of production. Now, it's easy. You can actually talk about these things that literally. But it's been 15 years, and they've refused to do it. So unfortunately, that combined with the fact that the ball was totally missed, that the opportunity and the chance was completely blown in 2016 to talk about the most critical implications of this kind of paradigm for strategic political reasons that to this day have not been actively addressed. Well, now we got to talk about it where it's at. And where it's at is we are in a situation where over and over again, we are being subjected to a process that is trying to compel us to assent to accepting performance of illegal contracts associated with production of somebody else's expectation of our energy performance, while mischaracterizing it and subjecting us to derivative processes to meet economic benchmarks somebody else set up without our informed consent. Now, you could say that this is a process of illegal debt and in violation of the 14th Amendment. It is. But it's actually literally slavery. We don't want to talk about it in that way. It sounds so disempowering. And if you have an expectation put upon you that you're supposed to demonstrate some form of resiliency in order to meet somebody else's indicators as part of their benchmarking index, well, it probably doesn't meet their production expectations when you refuse to demonstrate resiliency to fit their marketing profile and make them confront the fact that slavery is illegal. You're not allowed to own a slave. You're not allowed to be a slave. Period. It doesn't matter what age you are, and it doesn't matter how many drugs you try to give her or him, or how many drugs you get yourself. Even if you legalize all the drugs in the world, you're still not allowed to force somebody to consume drugs so you can try to make a justification for enslaving them. I wish we were at a different situation. For years, I was put into a paradigm where I was told that I needed somebody to trust me with an understanding that I understood the implications of their modality. It's been called different things over time. It's been called the sex trade. It's been called harm reduction. It's been called a variety of different matters, but nobody got to the essential matter at hand. Slavery is illegal. Doesn't matter how you gussy it up. It doesn't matter how well you can market it under a different term. There are specific legal definitions of slavery. If we don't address it as it is, then we're never going to be able to meet the expectations of performance that have been put upon us. This extortion scheme has been an ever-increasing and gradual buy-in to literally acceding to slavery. And the evidence is right there. The evidence is right there insofar as last weekend they literally flipped slave bonds that were over 150 years old. Slave bonds that were over 150 years old, that if you know how to look, are demonstrably recirculated and rolled over at specific periods of time connected to very, very, very serious crimes, including crimes of genocide, including crimes of comprehensive internment of women specifically to subject them to sexual slavery, and not just women. So we can't pretend here that we're in some sort of new frontier of sexual liberation with some sort of watered down neoliberal agenda. We have to confront it for what it is. If you were not satisfied with my attempt to be more diplomatic and addressing specific substantive issues regarding a question about the relationship between gang recruitment within the military and how people who have been recruited into gangs through their military service end up getting jobs in the police forces and in the private security sector, and that aids and abets the normalization and legalization of narcotics so that people who have infiltrated the social services sector and have also affiliated themselves with gangs can traffic women in order to smuggle drugs, weapons, and be involved in processes of creation of chemical and biological weapons? Fine, let's keep it where it is. We're going to talk about slavery. We're going to talk about slavery, and we're going to start comporting ourselves with what is the only reasonable action one can engage in when people refuse to take responsibility for what it means to try to prop themselves up as a legit slaver.